This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
South Africa's former President Jacob Zuma's arms deal trial postponed. Explosions rock Gaza as more are killed in fighting between Hamas and Israel. And French President Macron hosts Africa Summit on Sudan. Hello, welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. In business, South Africans brace for more power outages as the country's suppliers struggle to meet demand. And in sports, Barcelona thrashed Chelsea 4-0 to claim a first women's UEFA Champions League title. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. Great to have you along with me for this hour. Let's begin in South Africa, where the trial of former President Jacob Zuma, set for today, has been postponed to next week. And this is because Zuma lacks formal legal representation after the team withdrew on the 21st of April. The much anticipated trial is bringing to a head close to 2 decades of investigations into South Africa's multi-billion-dollar arms deal. Zuma is accused of receiving 791 illegal payments between 1995 and 2004 from his former financial advisor Schabir Shaik and Shaik's companies to help French arms manufacturer Thales secure lucrative defense contracts from the government as part of South Africa's 1999 armament deal. Let's bring in Angelo Coppola, who is standing by in Johannesburg. Angelo, welcome to the program. Angelo, observers had already been speculating that his case would be postponed. Can you give us more details?
Well, Richard, they were postponed for all the different reasons that we thought was going to happen. In fact, it turns out that Zuma's legal team planned to call for the recusal of Billy Downer. That's one of the reasons for the postponement, because the papers by the defense attorneys hadn't been filed in time, so the state couldn't respond. So that's one issue. The second issue is the fact that, in fact, they're also going to plea Jacob Zuma's official response to the charges that he's been faced with. So that's also been delayed because that hasn't been placed on record yet either. We do understand that the legal team of Zuma are in fact ready to proceed with trial. So while we initially thought that it might be used as an objective or objection by the defense team, it didn't turn out to be so. But it is seen as a delaying tactic by Zuma and his so-called Stalingrad approach to his legal woes that he's faced. He's always said he wanted to appear in court and have his day in court, but he's done everything in his power to avoid having his day in court. So today's proceedings were also delayed this morning by about an hour because the legal teams from the defense and the state side were arguing with the judge in terms of what to do next. So the co-defendants in this case with Zuma are in fact those senior French arms dealer company Thales representatives. They weren't in court physically, but they were there virtually. So we're going to have to wait until the 26th to see what happens then, Richard.
All right, we'll wait for the 26th. Now that the trial has been pushed forward, Angelo, what next?
Well, Richard, both parties, that's Thales and Zuma's defense attorneys, have said that they're ready to proceed with trial. In fact, it's good news because it's taken 22 years to get to this point. We know that the first witness in the state's case is Patricia de Lille, who's currently the Minister of Public Works. She was the original whistleblower, and at that stage when she was a member of the opposition party. But we don't have a fixed date for what happens after the 26th. So we don't know when that's going to actually happen and when Zuma's official plea is going to be heard. We believe it's next week, but it could be delayed for a whole range of different reasons. But they do plan, that's Zuma's legal team, do plan to call for recusal of Billy Downer, the lead state prosecutor. And they say that's because he's considered to be biased And he also doesn't like ZUMA, and that's according to sources in the ZUMA camp. The problem, though, is that the Downer matter has already been dealt with some time ago, and it was resolved, everybody thought. The NPA, of course, that's the National Prosecuting Authority, aren't happy that this matter has been raised again, but they're ready to proceed, as they say. Currently, as I mentioned, Public Works Minister Patricia de Lille has been asked to stand down. She'll be called to court again when she will actually give her physical evidence. It could happen at any time. De Lille, has been around and waiting for this to happen for at least 10 years. And she told reporters, in fact, earlier, after the proceedings had been postponed, that she was ready to deliver her witness testimony. Richard?
Angela Coppola speaking to us from Johannesburg. We appreciate that update and report. Thank you very much indeed. To the Middle East now, where hostilities between Gaza and Israel show no signs of abating. Israel continued to pound the Palestinian enclave with artillery fire on Monday morning. Israel says it was targeting what it calls underground tunnels used by Hamas and Palestinian militants to fire rocket barrages at Israeli cities. It also says it struck 9 residences belonging to high-ranking Hamas commanders. Local authorities in Gaza say the strikes caused widespread power cuts and have damaged hundreds of buildings. The health ministry there has put the death toll since the hostilities flared at 197, including 58 children and 34 women. 10 people have been killed in Israel, including 2 children. Let's cross live to Gaza, where CGTN's Noor Harazin is standing by. Noor, welcome to the program. Noor, can you give us an update on the situation in Gaza?
Well, for the 7th day in a row, and the Gaza Strip has been living through terrifying days and nights. Overnight here in the Gaza Strip, there was
All right, well, apparently we've lost.
Really, tanks fired more than 300.
Go ahead, Nora. Nora, if you can hear me, can you give us an update on the situation, the latest situation in Gaza right now?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay, well, for the 7th day in a row, the people of the Gaza Strip has been living through a very terrifying day and night. Overnight here in Gaza, the Israeli warplanes launched a wide-scale air operation and also land operation on the Gaza Strip. More than 150 airstrikes hit the Gaza Strip overnight, and down most of these airstrikes targeted roads, farms, factories, residential buildings. At the same time, the Israeli tanks along the borderline between Gaza and Israel shelled the Gaza Strip with more than 300 missiles. Every now and then we can hear the voices of new Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. Only an hour ago from now, the Israeli warplanes targeted a car in western Gaza City. I'm at the Shifa hospital now, and I can confirm that at least 4 people arrived killed by this latest Israeli attack in western Gaza. The numbers, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, are going up every minute, so it is safe to say that the death toll in Gaza is more than 195 people, including 58 children, and more than 1,400 people were injured.
All right, distressful images we are witnessing there. Tense situation, no doubt. Noura, we have reports coming in that Palestinians have been fleeing over the border to avoid attacks. Can you tell us more?
Well, yes, hundreds of Palestinian families had to evacuate their homes in order to save themselves from the Israeli missiles. And this happens while Palestinians are commemorating the 73rd the 73rd anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, where Palestinians left their homes, and right now millions of Palestinians are living in diaspora and refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria. And the same thing is happening in Gaza these days. In 2021, hundreds of families had to flee their homes, afraid of and fearing an Israeli escalation and Israeli ground invasion. At the same time, hundreds of families also lost their homes during the Israeli attack on Palestinian homes and Palestinian towers. Now the UN schools in Gaza are filled with families who are homeless, and this is a very harsh thing on the Palestinian people, especially that rebuilding these housing units could take years.
All right. Nur Harzim, bringing us some context and an update there. We appreciate your analysis. Earlier, we spoke with Hamas's spokesperson, Abdul Latif, who said a ceasefire can only happen once Israel stops its aggression against Palestinians.
Israel initiated the conflict and aggression, which started in several places, including residential areas in Sheikh Jarrah, the square in Jerusalem's Old City, the Gaza Strip, and West Bank. The ceasefire can only happen if Israel stops all kinds of attacks and aggression towards Palestinian people. Then will Hamas consider talks with Israel and offer options. Hamas is fighting back to protect the Palestinian people. Will not let the Palestinian people suffer these violations on their own.
The United Nations Security Council is calling for a ceasefire as it's held its first public meeting since the recent escalation in violence. At least 188 people have died in the Palestinian territory of Gaza and at least 10 in Israel. William Denslow reports from the UN headquarters in New York.
As the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalates, the international community is working to strike a peaceful resolution.
The current hostilities are utterly appalling. This latest round of violence only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction and despair, and pushes farther to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace.
The United Nations has met 3 times in the past week to discuss the ongoing violence seen in Israel and Gaza. But Sunday's meeting was the first not to be held behind closed doors. The meeting was chaired by China. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says a ceasefire should be a priority.
The Security Council, shouldering the primary responsibility for safeguarding international peace and security, must take strong actions on the Palestine-Israel conflict, reiterate its firm support for the two-state solution, and do more to cool down the situation as soon as possible.
As Israel and Palestinian casualties grow, the two sides showed no signs of backing down during the Security Council meeting.
We will take all steps necessary to defend our people. Now, the choice is yours. The world is watching.
The international consensus you have all helped shape and defend is being destroyed in front of our very eyes. The alternative that Israel chose is apartheid.
The meeting concluded with the Security Council again unable to issue a unified press statement, reportedly due to reluctance from the US as it carries out its own behind-the-scenes efforts to end the violence.
After the meeting, China, Tunisia and Norway issued a statement calling on all sides to cease hostilities. China holds the rotating Security Council presidency this month and vows to keep pushing the Council to take action and speak with a unified voice. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Meanwhile, the Independent's Middle East correspondent Belle True has been following the unfolding situation from Jerusalem, and she joins me now with the latest. Belle, welcome to Africa Live. Belle, Israel launches new strikes. Can you give us more details?
Absolutely. There was another massive bombardment over Gaza last night. I was speaking to civilians who talked about there being around 50 airstrikes in just a matter of minutes. The Israeli army released a statement this morning saying they were targeting what they call is the metro. It's an underground network of tunnels they say that militants use during fighting, and they managed to target around 15 kilometers of those tunnels. We haven't got an updated death toll overnight yet, but I imagine that it will be rising. But certainly speaking to civilians on the ground, they said it was very, very intense, and the Israeli military said that they had managed to knock out quite a large section of this underground network.
Meanwhile, there have been international calls for a ceasefire, and they continue to mount. As ever, there are two sides to every story. What are Israeli authorities saying? Belle?
Well, it doesn't look like there's going to be a ceasefire in the immediate term. Certainly, Benjamin Netanyahu has talked about this lasting for several days, and I've been talking to different generals who said they have specific targets they want to take out before they can talk about an element of a truce. From Hamas's side, they have also had quite heavy rhetoric talking about continuing, but they positioned it more in an eye for an eye situation. They said, if you hit us, we hit you. If you hit our civilians, we will hit your civilians. So at the moment, it doesn't look likely, even though there is a US envoy in town at the moment doing furious negotiations, even though Egyptian mediators have been shuttling between both sides, it doesn't look like either want this to end anytime soon. But certainly from the Israeli side, they have specific targets they want to take. They've talked about a zero tolerance level towards rocket fire from Gaza. They want to take out, they say, Hamas's capabilities to be able to target Israelis in Israel. And so that is undermining any efforts for an immediate truce in the next few days.
All right, Belle True speaking to us from Jerusalem. Belle, thank you for bringing all of that there to light. Let's turn our attention to Egypt, where the country has, in the meantime, opened the Rafah border crossing a day earlier than planned. It's to allow passage for Gaza, its students, people needing medical treatment and other humanitarian cases. The border is the main exit point for the majority of Gaza's population. More than 200 people are said to have already crossed into Egypt. Even before Sunday's reopening, Egypt had been picking up people wounded in Israeli bombardments at the crossing. It has so far sent 16 ambulances to pick up casualties, most of whom had suffered serious injuries that required immediate surgical procedures. The Rafah border had been closed for the Eid al-Fitr holiday. Now let's cross to our correspondent, Adel El-Mahroui in Cairo. As always, Adel, welcome to the program. Adel, what's the current situation at the Egyptian-Palestinian border?
As you briefly mentioned, since Sunday morning, Egypt has opened the Rafah passage openly and widely to maintain a regular flow of citizens, especially those who have been injured. Ambulances are standing by at the crossing to transport immediately anyone in critical condition. 3 hospitals in Egypt have been primarily designated to welcome and receive Palestinians who have been injured from the Israeli airstrikes and bombings. 2 of them are in North Sinai, in Bir Abd and El Arish, the closest to the Rafah passage. The third is a bit farther away in El Ismailiyah city, across the Sinai Peninsula, and where advanced medical facilities are more available. That will be mainly for those who have been severely injured or are at critical conditions. Meanwhile, a flow of medical supplies have been flowing into Gaza from Egypt. Trucks are going in around the clock. And at the same time, the Egyptian Doctors Syndicate has opened registration for doctors who want to volunteer to assist in providing medical services to Palestinians. And in just 2 days, about 1,200 Egyptian doctors have volunteered on the syndicate's website, according to a statement from the president of the Egyptian Doctors Syndicate.
Adel, in the past, Egypt has been in the front line in mediation efforts. Would you say that this is the case in the latest escalation?
Egypt always is keen to be in the front line of mediation efforts, especially when it turns to a violent confrontation between Hamas in Gaza and Israel. Since May 13th, an Egyptian security delegation went into the Gaza Strip to meet some Hamas officials, and from there it moved forward to continue its trip to Israel, specifically Tel Aviv, where this security delegation has been so far for about 4 or 5 days now, been in continuous talks with Israeli officials. No report that this security delegation has came back to Cairo yet. So Egypt is trying to lead that. The Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry has been in phone calls with his Israeli counterpart, condemning the escalation and trying to work out a way to reach a ceasefire and complete cessation of any kind of hostilities from both sides, which so far until the past few days, both Hamas and Israeli officials have been rejecting to resort to calm. So Egypt expanded this approach to reach for European countries, the EU. Yesterday, Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry was speaking to the UN Security Council. So because of its proximity to the Gaza Strip, it shares border with Gaza and Israel, Egypt considers itself more or less a regional leader and a vital player responsible to maintain stability in this part of the world. And that's why Egypt has never in the past, not even with what we're seeing today in the current situation, has been saving any effort to try to reach a ceasefire as much as possible. It's always a diplomatic challenge for Egypt, and when achieved, it's always a source of pride for Egypt to broker a ceasefire between the two.
Indeed. Adel Al-Mahroui, thank you for your insight and analysis. We appreciate it very much. Time now for a short break. You are watching Africa Live. Here's what's coming up. French President Macron hosts Africa Summit on Sudan, and how the Indian COVID crisis has affected Kenyans seeking medical treatment.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for sticking with us. Let's turn our attention to France, where President Emmanuel Macron is hosting African leaders, diplomats, and lenders at a summit aimed at helping Sudan recover after years of conflict. Several heads of state are attending the meeting in Paris to discuss investment in Sudan. They are also expected to negotiate its debt to help the government of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok in the transition after the 2019 ouster of President Omar al-Bashir. Let's speak to our CGTN correspondent, Yasser Hakim in Cairo. Yasser, as always, welcome to Africa Live. Can you tell us more about this meeting and expectations from the summit?
Yes, there are about 25 countries and international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank attending. And we understand that there will be 3 sessions. The opening session where there will be remarks from heads of these institutions and states. And then there will be 2 other sessions. One where Sudan will outline its economic reform policy that is ongoing along with the IMF and with approval from the IMF to try to rebuild the economy after decades of turmoil, economic turmoil. And then a third session whereby also Sudan will be giving ideas about the type of investments that it is seeking from the donor nations and international investors. And mainly it's about restructuring the infrastructure, about energy, about production industries, about real estate. So it's a whole host of investments that Sudan is hoping that it can encourage and attract the businessmen from around the world to try to establish their businesses in Sudan and help rebuild the economy. Already before the summit, there have been some countries that have managed to also give up some of their arrears. You know that Sudan has about $60 billion of debt, and some of it to the IMF, some of it to donor countries like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and France, the three biggest, and also the United States. Some countries have waived their arrears, such as the UK and the United States, for example, so that Sudan can pay its arrears to the IMF. France is expecting to do so today during the summit, around $1.5 billion. China has already given up a lot of its debt, not just the arrears, not the interest, but the debt itself has reduced a big portion of the debt, and also has given some leverage to repay part of the debt on a longer term basis. So just before the summit begins, there is the chance, and there is the opportunity for Sudan to feel optimistic that there will be a positive reaction from these donor countries, and that it will be able to first of all reduce its debt, reduce its arrears, so that it can also receive more funding for rebuilding the economy. And I have more details in this report. Sudan is still suffering from decades of an international economic embargo, exacerbated by the fallout from the coronavirus pandemic. France, Sudan's second largest creditor, is spearheading efforts to support the North African country in its transitional period after an uprising that ousted former President Omar al-Bashir in 2018.
It has galvanized and brought together 25 European partners, as well as the United States and the international banks and monetary funds, so that it will help Sudan in the first day of the conference to present to the world community its success in the economic reform and its quest for more investments in all domains, particularly in the 4 areas named as energy, mining, and telecommunication and infrastructure. It is now playing a fundamental role in dealing with the Sudanese quest for economic reconstruction and in relieving Sudan from its debt. And of course, in opening Sudan for new opportunities, new investments, opening the economy to the outside world.
Sudan's debt is around $60 billion, a huge burden that needs to be lifted. But experts say the conference is not just about waiving loans.
Sudan needs investments. Sudan is not in Paris to beg debt relief or to beg for financial support. I should expect a great part of this debt to be relieved. But what is more important is that international partners will participate in the economic reform success that the IMF is conducting now with Sudan.
Financial backing would aid Sudan in dealing with 300% inflation rates, growing poverty levels, unemployment, lack of basic commodities, and a broken down infrastructure. It would also ease the political transition into a democracy. The Paris conference is not a one-time event. There will be a July round where private and public sector Sudanese companies will be meeting with foreign investors to put pen to paper on several projects in Sudan. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And to the COVID-19 pandemic now, and Thailand has announced a record high number of new coronavirus cases, close to 10,000, nearly 4 times the number announced yesterday. Most of these were detected in the country's prison system. Our correspondent Martin Lowe has more in Bangkok.
Out of those 10,000, which of course is by far a record for Thailand, some 7,000 almost are from Thai jails. Mass testing began after 3,000 cases were discovered at 2 prisons here in the capital. Bangkok. Then they started testing all around the country. They've now found another 7 cases. In total, that means 10,000 cases in prisons, which is 10% of all the infections that have occurred here in Thailand since the pandemic began. And now, of course, prisoners are already constrained inside their prison, but of course you still have people going in and out. Although family visits have been banned, you have officers that have to come and go, and you have delivery people, so there is concern. Now, just to give this some kind of context, let me remind you that up until last December 2020, Thailand had only had around 3,000 cases and 60 deaths. And now, in those few short months since then, that number's gone up to more than 100,000 cases and more than 500 deaths. Thailand has now had more coronavirus infections than China, although it is still fewer than its Southeast Asian neighbours. Places like Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia and Myanmar have had more. But with that 10,000 new cases today, that's by far the biggest daily increase.
The African continent heavily relies on India for specialized treatment, surgical operations, and the supply of medication. But with India battling the world's largest surge in COVID-19 cases, healthcare in Africa and Kenya in particular is feeling the heat too. CGTN's Enoch Sekolia reports.
It's now evident that the COVID-19 situation in India is heavily affecting the African continent, with many patients being forced to seek specialized treatment elsewhere.
I wanted to go to India. I really wanted to go to India because
John Otanga is a freelance videographer with a Kenyan TV station. He has battled blood cancer for the last decade, and doctors have advised him to conduct a bone marrow transplant. India was his choice.
We thought the pandemic in India was going to be done maybe soon, but now it's taking longer than we expect. And for me, I need the treatment as soon as possible.
And that has forced him to look for treatment closer home, Egypt.
We didn't know so much about Egypt. At this point, we are just trying to find somewhere. You can see the rates, because in India we were given the treatment plan. We knew the cost. It was only for us to try and collect our funds and getting ready for everything, since we had all the details concerning the treatment and the accommodation.
I'm Richard. Dr. John Mwangi is a consultant surgeon based in Nairobi. He says India's health crisis has a far-reaching impact on the African continent.
It also affects the pharmaceutical industry because we rely a lot on medications that we import from India, including the vaccine itself. You know, we got the first dose, but we have not managed to get the second dose because there are limitations in production and availability, access.
India's temporary ban on COVID-19 vaccine export is slowing Africa's inoculation efforts. Most countries were relying on jabs from the Serum Institute of India. According to Dr. Mwangi, India's COVID-19 crisis should be a wake-up call for the African continent. He says governments need to invest in healthcare, from infrastructure development to specialized training of healthcare workers.
And now people are opening their eyes and seeing what are the local resources, what is the infrastructure, what is the capacity, what can be done locally.
John Otanga agrees.
It can be done in Kenya as long as we have the required facilities.
For John Otanga, revising his plans for the bone marrow transplant has come at an extra cost, but he hopes Egypt will still give him the services he needs. Enoch Sekolia, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
The news continues on Africa Live. We'll see you on the other side of the break with our business segment. Here's what's ahead. Coming up in business, South Africans brace for more power outages. And foreign investment in healthcare picks up in Egypt.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to Africa Live. We appreciate your company. I'm Richard Nta. Let's begin with the African Summit in France. President Emmanuel Macron is hosting African leaders, diplomats, and lenders at a summit aimed at helping Sudan recover after years of conflict. Several heads of state are attending the meeting in Paris to discuss investment in Sudan. All right, let's dive deeper into this. Dr. Mustafa Ali, the chairman of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, joins us to discuss France-Sudan Summit. Doctor, welcome to the program. Dr. Ali, officials say the summit aims to unite the international community around helping Sudan in particular. How significant is this?
Thank you. The summit on Sudan hosted by France is significant for Sudan itself. For the last 30 years, in fact, over 3 decades, Sudan has been one country that has been condemned and denounced for a number of ills, including terrorism and crimes against humanity. And Sudan effectively now is moving away from condemnation, denunciation, to a country that is now being commended, recommended, and complemented by international community. This is significant for Sudan to move forward, especially now that it has better democratic credentials. Secondly, Sudan is part of the Horn of Africa conflict system. And the Horn of Africa is now, it has more countries sliding towards anarchy and more conflict. And there is no better time than now to have Sudan, which is a part of that conflict system, being assisted and helped to come out of its own internal conflict so that it can also assist in shaping the Horn of Africa to be more stable.
Dr. Mustafa Ali, you mentioned Sudan is still faced with enormous challenges as it transitions from authoritarian rule to democracy. How will this summit count and make a difference?
It's going to count. It's going to make a difference. One, because of the injection of financial assistance and other resources that this particular summit is going to help position Sudan to be able to attract critical assistance from multilateral institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and many other bilateral institutions, including the countries in the West, so that it can help grow its economy in order to serve its citizens better.
Okay, that brings me to my final question, Doctor. France has taken the lead in recent days to support Sudan. What's in it for France?
France is trying to leverage itself in the region. It's been working very closely with Djibouti and in Djibouti with its camp there. France is trying to extend its geostrategic influence in the Horn of Africa. Remember, it's been working very closely with Chad. Chad and Sudan are very much connected, and having its foothold in Sudan is going to assist it in pushing further and having its interests in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa secured through Sudan.
All right, Dr. Mustafa Ali, thank you so much for lending your wisdom to this conversation. Much appreciated. Let's turn our attention now to South Africa, where the country's state-owned electricity supplier Eskom says it will cut 2,000 megawatts from the grid from Sunday to Tuesday. And that's after losing 10 generating units at some of its key power stations. Eskom plans to reintegrate rolling blackouts due to steam leaks at its Matla plant, while generation has also been affected at the Mudupi, Kusile, and Duva plants. This comes as the debt-laden firm struggles to meet demand at a time when industries are barely recovering from pandemic-induced losses. And staying in South Africa, food prices are on the rise again as global commodities and international oil prices rebound. Food inflation is the highest since September last year, with experts warning that consumers will bear the brunt. Richard Nta reports.
The cost of preparing even a simple meal is rising. Basic foods, fruits, vegetables and meat prices are not only increasing but are also becoming unpredictable, making budgeting a nightmare. It's a double whammy for restaurants. Many have reopened, but to limited patrons as COVID remains a concern.
It is ridiculous. I mean, every week almost you can see the prices just doing this. Meat, probably one of the bigger purchases in the business. That's where we're seeing the instability. Every other week it's, guys, we're gonna have to increase prices because the farmers are saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how do we control our costs here and manage to keep the customers sitting on the chairs?
In April, the price of tomatoes skyrocketed by 21%. This was because of heavy rains at the end of 2020 that ruined a number of crops. Apart from adverse weather conditions, international oil prices are rising, as well as agricultural commodities. This has led to higher input costs. Producer price inflation jumped from 4% in February to 5.2% in April.
We also had supply constraints at some point in the year, but we don't expect the food inflation to kick up the lights, or rather to knock out the lights in this regard. This is mainly because of just the good prospect of harvest and produce that we're expecting for the year, coupled with a firmer rand that we're seeing. We feel that that would cushion the blow of some of the costs that have been climbing, which include electricity costs, which include the national minimum wage that we've seen.
Agriculture producer inflation came in at 7.2% last month. Dairy, cereal and other crops made up 12.6% and 17.2% of that respectively.
I've resorted to actually making my own bread instead of buying bread, because getting bread for 15, 16 rand a loaf is just ridiculous. But the meat prices also have gone up, and one thing that has helped me is buying in bulk and building up relationships with other wholesalers.
In March, consumer inflation rose to 3.2%, back into the Reserve Bank's 3 to 6% target band. The largest contributor to that inflation figure was the food and non-alcoholic beverages category, rising 5.7%.
April inflation figures are due out next week, around the same time that the Reserve Bank will meet to decide on rates. The Reserve Bank has suggested that it will keep rates on hold only if inflation remains under control. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Healthcare is one of the sectors that have expanded during the coronavirus pandemic. Foreign investments have been dwindling in this industry for the past few years, but they have shown some improvements in the last year. Yasser Hakim spoke with a top executive of a foreign medical group about the investment opportunities in Egypt's health sector.
The Saudi-German hospitals, the first in Africa to join the Mayo Clinic Care Network, is planning further expansion in the Egyptian market.
After Saudi-German Hospital Cairo, we are working now for the medical city in Alexandria, then the medical city in Giza. We are working to find, at least for the first phase, 10 medical cities here in Egypt.
They're eyeing investments exceeding $3 billion. The regional director says Egypt is an attractive destination for foreign investments.
In Egypt, the population is increasing from year to year, and with this increasing, we can find that there is increase also in the demand of the number of beds in Egypt. So I can say that the investment in healthcare in Egypt is very important and required for the coming decades. And we can find that there is already a gap before, and this gap is increased from year to year. There is a lot of support from all the authorities here in Egypt regarding the investment overall, especially in healthcare.
And foreign investments have been flowing in. Several factories in COVID-19 personal protective equipment are up and running. Egypt's first pharma city was inaugurated in April. There's been an increase in hospital beds, more lab centers, and about 47 new hospitals under construction. Meanwhile, Chinese and Russian COVID vaccines are to be locally manufactured. With the third wave of coronavirus hitting the country, the role of the private sector in fighting the pandemic has become essential.
For the first wave of corona, the public hospitals started to lead the management of the crisis alone. But recently they started to involve the private sector in this crisis. Now, within the wave 3 for COVID-19 here in Egypt, we have more control together, and we are working together to provide better services for the community.
And a comprehensive health insurance program being implemented on the ground will help most of the population afford treatment in private hospitals, boosting demand for even more investments. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
China says its economy continued its stable recovery in April. The National Bureau of Statistics says the total value added of major industrial enterprises grew by 9.8% year on year. Officials add that investment in fixed assets continued to recover, and investments in the primary and high-tech industries also saw an increase. Meanwhile, the total value of imports and exports of goods increased by more than a quarter in April. Much of the United Kingdom is reopening on Monday, with restaurants and bars now once again allowed to serve customers inside. More than 55 million people have received at least one dose of a vaccine, but there's still concerns over more contagious variants spreading. Lola Abdafid has more.
Confidence is returning, and so are the customers. This cheese market is reopening for the first time since the UK's third lockdown 6 months ago. For nearby cafes and restaurants, income will increase as soon as they serve customers indoors.
It's 6 months of struggle, and we finally are able to serve customers inside, maximising the space, allocating good, safe area. We've got 2 floors to fill. I can't wait to fill them.
In many ways, with so many people now vaccinated in the UK, people are socialising again, and in greater numbers, not just in cafes and restaurants, but also in shopping areas and markets.
But it's been a tough year. A tenth of restaurants won't be reopening, according to one survey, which says thousands of establishments across Britain have closed, with almost 10% fewer restaurants in operation than before the pandemic began. Those still open have had to adapt and often borrow to keep their businesses viable.
People have borrowed a lot of money. That debt needs to be serviced. So as we're moving forward, landlords are going to want rent that they've, there's a lot of things going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. And I think that's probably the most challenging time for businesses.
The UK government is keen to remove most COVID restrictions in 5 weeks' time, but it's been criticised for not responding sooner to the variant first found in India, which is spreading in parts of the UK. Ministers could find it difficult to reintroduce social distancing rules, with expectations rising that the UK is safe against COVID.
New variants are one of the biggest risks to this opening. Because of the speed of transmission of this one, it can really spread like wildfire amongst the unvaccinated groups. Hence, we need to get as many people vaccinated as possible.
For most of the past year, city centres have been quiet. Suburbs have fared better, with local, loyal clientele. But other costs will feature as soon as government help for businesses is phased out.
We are still possibly looking at starting to pay business rates from June onwards. Maybe at a reduced rate. Furlough coming to an end at the end of the summer. So whatever savings we've had financially over the last years were depleted. So having to stand on your own from end of June onwards or July onwards, it is a scary thing.
May 17 is a big step for tens of thousands of businesses, hoping the virus will recede so their profits can return. Yolo David, CGTN, London.
And we're not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Don't go away. Here's a peek at the headline. In sports, Barcelona thrashed Chelsea 4-0 to claim a first Women's UEFA Champions League title.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment